to start. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Noha Abu Dahab, Assistant Professor of International Law at Georgetown University in Qatar, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion and to welcome you all to this special edition of Qatar Foundation's Education City Speaker Series. In just over a year from now, Doha will host the second World Summit for Social Development, a vital step in reinforcing a global commitment to achieving the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Its aim is to set the world on a trajectory based around fairness and sustainability for the rest of this decade and beyond. And we don't have to look very far to realize how much of a challenge that presents. And so we are delighted that Amina J. Mohammed, United Nations Deputy Secretary General, is here with us today as our guest speaker to look ahead to the summit, its goals, and why it matters, as well as how to overcome the obstacles to shaping the global society we want to see. I'll be discussing all of this and more with Amina shortly, after which we'll take questions from the audience in a 20-minute question and answer session. But first, I'd like to give the floor to our guest and her message. Your Excellency, Amina Mohammed, please, welcome.
Thank you so much. His Excellency Hamid Al-Kuwari, our President of the QNL, Excellencies that are in the room, but most importantly, the students. It's wonderful to be with you here, really delighted that I'm able to see so many. But let me first of all start by thanking the Qatar Foundation for organizing what is a really important and timely event, and for the government of Qatar for generously agreeing to host the second World Summit for Social Development in November 2025. It's a great opportunity to try to help shape the common vision for the upcoming summit and to ensure its success, building on the recent Pact to the Future that we had in New York at the high-level meetings. It's almost 30 years ago, the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development and its program of action established a path-breaking new consensus which put people at the center of development. This was strengthened by the Beijing Platform for Women, and this vision was later enshrined in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Since Copenhagen Summit in 1995, we have had remarkable progress. However, recent overlapping crises have stalled or reversed progress in many of these areas. Uneven progress, coupled with the lingering effects of economic recovery from COVID-19, rising geopolitical conflicts, the climate crisis, and economic disruptions like the debt crisis, have deepened inequalities and placed significant stress on countries' fiscal space for investing in sustainable development, and the brunt, of course, being felt by people. The number of people living in extreme poverty, almost 700 million and growing. The number of people facing hunger, over 730 million and growing. Access to quality and relevant education, decent work, universal health care, social protection and digital connectivity still remains limited, with billions at risk of being left behind. The message is clear and it's stark. The outlook for achieving people-centered development and meeting the Sustainable Development Agenda is very fragile. But it isn't too late to change course. We need to step up our efforts and reaffirm our commitment of leaving no one behind. And when we say leave no one behind, it really is in every single context, whether it is a country or a community, to identify who those no ones are and factor them into the planning and the investments that we make for people and our planet. We do need urgent, coordinated reforms and harmonization of social, economic, and fiscal policies, and we also need genuine partnerships. The recently adopted Pact for the Future proposes a number of commitments and solutions. It reinforces the promise to deliver Agenda 2030, so it's not a new framework, but it is one to lift the existing frameworks that we have. It includes what we refer to as an SDG stimulus, actually named really to get through the door of ministers of finance when we were talking about investments in development. That also has included a review of the sovereign debt architecture, It also has looked at providing the reform of the global financial architecture, long ago designed for a time that it no longer represents. It provides developing countries with the support and the safety net that they need to invest in their people and the systems they require. The pact also proposes solutions to strengthen peace and security and redoubles the world's commitment to human rights and international law. And we know today that that is challenged, and in many cases we have crossed many red lines. It is an important reminder that social development cannot be attained in the absence of peace and security, or in the absence of respect for human rights and all fundamental freedoms. The pact is going further to embrace the new era of technology and provide the guardrails for the opportunity of such technology as AI to better connect and reap the benefits for everyone. The Social Summit comes at an opportune time. With only 5 years left to achieve the SDGs, we will need to address all 17 goals, from poverty, hunger, and inequality to education, peace, and inclusivity. The 2025 summit, as we see it, must culminate in a detailed and measurable action plan for social development that is fit for the 21st century, safeguarding the progress that we have made over the years. The summit will also be informed by outcomes of the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, member states' progress on the Pact of the Future's commitments to invest in people, in poverty, hunger, and strengthen trust and social cohesion. At every step, the process towards the summit must be inclusive, and there will be many opportunities to engage at the country level, at the global level, and in particular through regions. It will also hope to respond to people's realities and expectations, especially those of young people. There must be not just a provision and a space for voices of people to be heard, but there needs to be an intergenerational conversation. Those who are and have been around with experiences and certainly the exposure to many, to what many of you have not had, but then you have your aspirations. You need to shape the future. And when we say that we want that intergenerational conversation, it is about shaping the future together. It's about co-creating that future. Open and broad consultations will be the opportunity, I believe, to build more trust. Today, we are shaken by what we see in many places as double standards in the international community, and we're questioning them. We're questioning multilateralism. And I hope that this will help us to reinforce the connection between people and our governments, but also between people and the global institutions that actually serve them. It will be an opportunity to shape the societies that we want, tailor-made, and I would say to benefit our rich heritage and the fabric that underpins the very foundation of inclusive and caring societies. Just today, we've had the opportunity to listen to many at the Families Summit here. This is a resolution that came about 30 years ago, and Qatar has been at the forefront of discussing that agenda of what a family means, that unit in society that really, if is not taken care of, then societies fall apart, and we've seen that in many, many places. But today, this means many different things for many different people. And so as we move ahead, safeguarding the progress in the long run, we should join forces around a shared agenda, find the commonalities, the things that bring us together and not divide us, understanding that our diversity in this human family is actually a strength and not a weakness. And there are many threads to that fabric. Here, we hope that we'll see that this is underpinned by solidarity, respect, and trust. Humble ourselves that this is a task that is bigger than any one person or one country. It requires a family to take us to those aspirations. Throughout, let's aim high. Don't ever let anyone tell you that this is okay for you. What is okay for you is what you think is okay for you. Think right up there with the stars. Let us seek innovative approaches to engagement, co-creation, and finding consensus. But consensus not at the lowest common ambition, at the highest common ambition. That's what the SDGs were in 2017. And that in 2015, and it's important that we keep the highest ambition while remaining steadfast in accelerating progress towards the SDGs. We are only 17% towards the SDGs today. That's fail by any standard. And if we are to get to the SDGs, an enormous amount of work has to be done at scale with a real sense of urgency. The leadership of the government of Qatar and key partners as the foundation I'm sure that we're going to make the Social Summit a place where we lay solid foundations for advancing a key strand of that sustainable development agenda, the social pillar. So thank you for joining us on this journey, and I really do look forward to the conversation today. Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes? All right. Well, thank you very much for that, Your Excellency Amina, Mohammed, and welcome once again to the Education City Speaker Series. One of the major challenges, it seems, that prevents the fulfillment of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, is that even when states make commitments, they don't follow through. And so I wanted to talk about accountability first. What sort of accountability mechanisms exist to address this? And if there aren't sufficient accountability mechanisms, what do you think needs to happen to improve accountability?
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, when we talk about commitments of states, it's all states. It's those who have made them to try to ensure that our global family is able to attain the goals that we set. But it's also about states on the receiving end that have responsibilities too. So never to conflate the two. There is a division of labor here. I think they probably were held in countries that are receiving to higher standards than those who have made the commitments. And we see this over and over again when the measures of failure are invariably on the countries that are supposed to be implementing rather than those that are supposed to be making the commitments. You will hear today that we are walking back in a number of women's rights. And what I will say is that did we make the commitments we made to investing in women's rights, have we made them to see that progress made? Invariably, no, we haven't. Not at the scale and with a sense of urgency in our economies, in civil society, in the investment that's required for research to help us get the baselines that we need for data and for empirical evidence. So I think that there is insufficient checks and balances to help us keep those commitments. We, of course, report on them. We try to allude to those that are not making it. If I take the climate agenda, for instance, we have COP29 coming up in Baku and in Azerbaijan, and it's a finance COP, and it will be about creating a new commitment to the goals, but we have to remember the previous one was not met. And who were those commitments supposed to be? So we've started to sort of hone in these days as diplomatically as we can to the group of countries that have not made them, and hope that with the pressure of civil society, with the pressure of other stakeholders, that we can bring them to the table. But there is no sign on this dotted line, and if you don't do it, you're going behind bars. Not today.
Okay, thank you for that. Global shocks and crises are constant setbacks to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's almost like it's taking one step forward and two steps back. So just a few examples from the horrors that continue to unfold in places not very far from us and that have set back the progress on the SDGs in unprecedented ways. The UN Conference on Trade and Development said last week that if the war on Gaza ends tomorrow, it could take 350 years for its economy to return to its precarious pre-war level. Not to mention, of course, the trauma and the long-term impact of domicide and scholasticide, now medicide, the attacks on hospitals and the health sector, and of course, genocide. Yemen is still reeling from the impact of its destructive war. Just last month, the UN said that by the end of this year, there will be a 34% increase in child malnutrition since last year. And in Sudan, where another devastating conflict continues to unfold, 26 million people suffer from acute hunger, millions have been internally displaced. Now, these humanitarian catastrophes are all man-made, right? And and the result of conflicts which so often prevent the SDGs from being implemented. Within the framework of the SDGs, what can effectively either reduce armed conflict or at least alleviate its impact?
Well, first things first, I think, we know we can resolve these. They're man-made, and let me just underscore, audience, man. Because if women were in leadership, we wouldn't be in the mess that we're in today. And this is important for conflict, because the burden of conflict is on women. It is on children. When I saw the war that was happening in Ethiopia and the aftermath of it, women were being discarded because 9 times out of 10 they were raped. Men were coming back home as heroes from the war. That in itself is an injustice. It's a human injustice. It's an atrocity to women, and we shouldn't accept it. And I think that we need to get back to our families. We need to get back to have a conversation with men. What is this all about? There is no war that is deserving of the kind of damage and atrocities that are committed on society. Now, I think that today we have gone so far and crossed so many red lines. Gaza is apparent, but there are many others. In Sudan, those 2 generals should not be doing what they're doing to their country today, for whatever reason they may think. And this is important. This is important for us to send that message. There must be a pathway back to peace. Now, often, if you're asking those who went to war, man-made as they may be, and you have no women at the table, then what are you expecting? There will not be lasting peace. And so just as we discussed women, peace and security in the Security Council last week, and we had a further discussion in Manila 2 days ago, unless women are at those tables where peace is being negotiated, where the implementation of the peace processes have to involve women, it just won't happen. And I think this is the first, some of the lessons that we have to take from the past in what we have to do to go forward. We have many examples of none of these wars, what we are seeing today and what we need to respond to, are not happening, as my Secretary General said, in a vacuum. There are root causes for this, and we need to address them. So when we're looking at the conflicts and the pathway to peace, it cannot just be the symptoms, because that's what we see, it is obvious. But we have to get behind that, and it's tough. It is tough to get to a table with people who are not talking. We need bridges. So beyond women being at the table, what else do we need? We need not the big countries. The big countries, quite frankly, are exacerbating the situation. We need smaller countries that don't appear to be a threat to anything, to build the bridges and to bring back the trust at the table that we can begin to discuss that pathway back to peace. But I think the conversations, the dialogue, the need for that to happen now has never been more real. You asked me, how does the SDG framework work for that? If we were investing in the development machine and not the war machine, we would be much further than we are now. But so long as war is a good business and we haven't been able to make the case and the incentives for peace through development, we will continue to go to war first. Again, on the Sustainable Development Agenda, really push this in every single country to see people at the center, to see economies grow. The SDGs are not about charity. It's not about ODA. It's about what we invest in people's economies so that they can grow them inclusively, to pay for basic services that are rights. But they do all stand on 2 pillars that I think are important. They stand on the pillars of institutions, whether they're democratic, that's your judiciary, it is your civil service. These are, if we don't have strong institutions, it won't hold. The second, of course, is the partnerships. And I think we have to question partnerships. We have to have criteria for what is genuine in a partnership. It cannot just be the resources that are given. What are the conditions tied to those resources? Is it a condition of friendship, of partnership, that there is a win-win on both sides? Or is it just, I'm giving you something that I know that you're not going to say no to because your people need it, but at the other end is a slipperier slope to nothing?
Well, you know, I'm glad that you raised this issue of root causes, because whereas we have the SDGs that articulate these goals, no poverty, no hunger, gender equality, climate action, among, of course, many others. In many parts of the world, and perhaps especially here in the global south, we suffer from these structural challenges such as dehumanization and racism and government policies that are designed to make the rich richer at the expense of the poor. So again, within the framework of the SDGs, how can we tackle those structural challenges such as dehumanization?
It's a difficult question because I think this comes from society. And in the end, what happens with the structures that we see is because we have got a society that's not engaged with how those structures are defined. Is democracy working for us? By and large, we've seen progress. We believe in the values of democracy. In fact, many have had democracy for centuries. But I question whether, in fact, the model for democracy, as we see it and as we place it on high of what we need to achieve, is failing today. We're not seeing leaders that are elected, which the vast population are looking at. Now, either the population's not voting or something's very wrong. But we are very much seeing now leadership that is consolidating structures that will exclude you, whether it is racism, other forms of discrimination, and where rights are no longer, they're no longer the purview of every citizen. It's of a few. And again, the SDGs have framed an agenda around leaving no one behind. And I think that does mean that reforms and transformations have to happen. They're not necessarily a benchmark that we hold in Geneva. We have a Charter on Human Rights, and it's a great charter. We've all signed on to it, mostly all signed on to it. We have the United Nations Charter. These are North Stars, these are guides. But the real change will come as to whether your constitution matters or not, whether in fact you're able to implement the rights in that constitution and that you have the structures and the laws and policies and regulations and safeguards that will allow you to have that done. But this is going to be about the voice of the people. It's going to be about the credibility of those who are representing you to do so. Now, we've often had civil society a strong voice. I think civil society space has been closed. I think that in some places, civil society talks about its representation of people. I think that allows parliamentarians and those who are elected to office off the hook. I think civil society needs to be much stronger about the issues. So if you want to talk about racism or dehumanization, they ought to be in there talking about that and pushing those representatives who are going to frame and develop the laws that are needed to put in place for the people. So the division of labor and where we are, now we can say, okay, civil society in some countries, those representatives in the parliament are not yours, it's a work in progress. Democracy is a work in progress, it's not, you're selected, not elected. People will argue about that, but I think fundamentally we have to do what is right. We have to put the pressure on the issues that we know best as civil society from our communities and take them to those places and push for those rights to happen. They not always happen overnight, but if we keep pushing for them, I think that we will go a lot further than we've gone today. Use the framework of the SDGs. Goal 16 is a great goal with targets that can be set that we should follow.
Okay. Let's talk about the role of the United Nations itself. We have seen the UN Security Council members use their veto in a way that has cost thousands of lives, exacerbated impunity, whether it's Syria, Palestine, or other places. And it seems that at the most critical times, we're still sort of beholden to global power politics in the form of veto shenanigans at the UN Security Council. So are we stuck with the UN Charter that was drafted within the context of the 1945 world without any meaningful prospect for it to adapt to the 2024 world? Is the UN really making progress in its primary mission to maintain international peace and security to save humanity from the scourge of war, as the UN Charter promised, or is there really no better option?
I don't think there's a better option. Quite frankly, I think that the Charter's not the problem, it's the people who are upholding the Charter that we have a problem with. We have great responsibility that has been given to the P5, our permanent 5 in the Security Council, and somehow they're not doing the best job that they ought to be doing today. I think that everyone sees that. There are 15 members of the Council, 5 with a veto. Today, those 10 members keep us going in the Security Council, bringing the resolutions forward that we never would have had if we just left it to the veto. So I think it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The Security Council has got a meaningful place. The Charter is a good guide to us, and we should hold on to it. But we need to find the mechanisms to be more representative of that Charter today. That was 1945, and today it needs a Charter that is represented by the world as it is today. Its powers, its population, the representation, it's not there. The Summit of the Future, the Pact did recognize representation needed to be there at the level of the veto. Of course, that's going to be difficult to achieve, but we don't stop making that ask for it to happen. Having said that, when we have seen that the Security Council has not stepped up, in fact, in some cases has thrown a spanner at the Charter itself, we have moved to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly is worthy. That's where every member is. That's where every member has a voice. Maybe not the same muscle, but they have a voice. And they have now a resolution which has gone through that says you can debate every veto, and you can vote, you can speak on it. And I think that's really important. And
veto initiative, that one? The veto initiative?
Yes, the veto initiative, which I think, let's not underestimate that, because once the General Assembly is able to discuss that, it gets visibility in all of your countries, visibility where the political might ought to and could be moved if really there was the will of the people to do that and to get behind it. It's easier said than done, this world today. I've looked at the General Assembly, and sometimes on very thorny issues, we've seen an increase in abstentions. Not no, so they probably agree, but we are such a connected world that the decision you take to say yes or no for some smaller countries has economic penalties. So it's not as easy to do. The alliances that are there are difficult to shake. But I think that we have put visibility on it. And if we didn't have that visibility, terrible things happen in the darkness. They're happening now in the daylight. Can you imagine if we didn't have the voice, we didn't have what we were able to see and to say and to continue to push for?
I mean, this question of UN Security Council reform has been around for a long time. Are you able to share with us any sort of news about that, any updates? I mean, you mentioned the veto initiative, but that's more of a General Assembly-driven thing. What? Any other updates on the reform issues?
Frankly, the best that you're going to see is what you saw in the Pact, which is representation. And even that representation, the first stop is Africa, 2 seats on the Council, permanent seats, and then to perhaps Latin America, perhaps an additional from Europe, but they're all contentious as to which countries those are. The fact that we're having those discussions that without the veto, they may be in the permanent members, is progress. It's not enough. But clearly, this is difficult. This is probably the most difficult time to have a discussion about the veto in the Security Council, and I don't think in the reform discussions member states have got there this time.
Okay. One final question from me before I turn it over to the audience for questions and answers. Next year, Doha will host the 2nd World Social Development Summit. What would you define as a successful summit next year?
I think clarity around what we want to see in the social summit that reinforces sustainable development and not another siloing of an issue that is integral to the economies, to the environment, and to societies that we see today. Copenhagen did a really good job. I think that we succeeded in including the ambition of that in the 2030 agenda. And I think this will be a reinforcement on labor, on education, on health. These have to be, I think, core to it. Inequalities, women, these all have to be seen as a major part of lifting that last mile the next 5 years towards the Sustainable Development Agenda. And I know many people will say, well, we're never going to get the SDGs by 2030, 70% off track. But we're not going to fail for want of trying. When we get to 2030, we'll have another set of goals. That's the way the world works. But we have to do our damnedest to get as close to it as possible. Lay very strong foundations that will allow us to get to more rather than less. And I think the World Social Summit for Development is going to be key in turning that corner. Remembering, of course, we have the financing for development. none of this would be such a major issue if we didn't have a financial architecture that's just not working for today. And I think that this is something that will be discussed in Spain in June next year, and it will reinforce then how we are going to lift a social agenda that is leaving more people behind than ever before.
Well, thank you so much, Amina, for that excellent discussion. I'd like to turn it to the audience now. Please make sure your question or comment is very concise so that we can take as many questions as possible in the time that's remaining. So just raise your hand and I will call. Someone will bring a microphone to you. So gentleman over here in the whitish jacket. And we'll take questions one by one, if that's okay with you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Excellency. It's great to see you here in Doha. And my question is about accountability. In light of ongoing atrocities in African conflict, especially in Ethiopia, in Yemen, what mechanism can the UN establish to hold accountable to those responsible for human rights violation, particularly when national or regional governments may be complicit? Thank you.
I mean, there are many. I mean, the toolbox of the UN is full for those tools that one can, first of all, document and then take to account. And if we look at the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, he can have investigations. Those investigations eventually will go through courts of law, and people will be held accountable as they were for the genocide in Rwanda. It takes time, but it's important that day by day we collect the evidence and we put it in we put it to the disposal in such shape that can be used in the future. It's, as I said, never an overnight. It's very easy to go to war. It's very difficult to come back from it, and it's even more difficult to hold to account. But that's what the UN does, and it takes years. And sometimes we get them, and sometimes we don't. We're still looking for the truth around Dag Hammarskjöld, our SG that went down in an aircraft so many years ago. In fact, I remember it always because it was the year of my birth, and we're still looking for justice for him. So it takes time, but there are processes, there are tools, it took South Africa to go to the ICJ, ICC to hold to a state to account. So we know that it's possible, and I think that we just need to use them more effectively and efficiently.
Can you switch it on? I'm not sure.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Amina. I mean, more than 70 or 80% of these crises are in our region, Africa, Arab world, and maybe Asian countries. And according to Chapter 6, that the regional organization, they have a role to play in order to settle these problems. In fact, the chapter itself, Chapter 6, says that the fairest option should be for the regional organization because they know better these problems. But what we can see now is that these regional organizations are not doing their job. Is this because that the Security Council, the UN, insists to intervene and not to leave them to do their job? Or because, as we can see in Africa, for example, now, that they have a shortage of finance and so on, and if the UN could provide them with sufficient finance, then they can settle this problem much better than the Security Council. Thank you.
There are a number of issues and the complexities of why Chapter 6 may not work or why things are happening the way they do in Africa, more conflicts than we can see anywhere in the region. I think at the end of the day, we will have to say that leadership plays a big role in what is happening on the continent. It plays a big role not just in Africa, but also in the Security Council and the way we come together to reinforce some of the commitments that we've made. We have sent mission after mission into Africa to keep the peace. Today, we are withdrawing those missions because there was no peace to keep. And I think it's a big question that we are all reflecting on. What next? And I think more and more everybody's coming back round to the conclusion we should have been investing in development. I make an example of my own country, Nigeria. I mean, we gave birth to Boko Haram. We gave birth to it in a town that I went to school. But I'm not a terrorist. And I can tell you the terrorists are not born. It's a set of conditions. So governance also plays a big part in it, besides the leadership. And in these cases, I think we are continuing to see that the root causes are not always just that you don't have the resources. It is governance, it is democracies that are not functioning. We have 4 unconstitutional changes in the Sahel alone. And that, if you speak to the generals, they will give you cause as to why that happened. What we need to do is to get them back on the process to a democracy, but hopefully not to the democracy they overthrew. So again, another complexity, are we just putting people back because we don't want to see the overthrow of a democracy? No, we need to check what happened and what happened to the institutions as we have them. Good news, yes, the regional organizations are not doing as much as they should, but with Resolution 2719, that has given us now some leverage to support, for the UN to support missions that are regional in upholding the peace, and to have a role that would do more than just peacekeeping. It would be peace enforcement as well. So I think we're slowly making that recognition that we do know where the shoe is pinching and we can do better. We are better on the ground. In fact, we have been on the ground, but this is, even with Resolution 2017, a lot has been done by the African Union and by the UN to try to forward it. It's still going through a large family at the UN to agree what we do. Haiti is another big example of a mission that didn't quite end well, and we went on to a political mission to try to see if we could get that transition. It did not happen. We put a police force in there to support Haiti, a police force that had to come all the way from Africa to the backyard of the United States to try to keep the peace. It is not working, and so now possibly a request coming from member states to say back again with a peace mission. So I think we have to look at the number of causes that we have that are real for many, and contend with them as well, not do this in isolation. We haven't spoken much yet. I suppose I will get the questions about it, but the economics as well, the funding and the resourcing of many developing countries is way, way behind the commitments that have been made, and continues to be exacerbated by one issue or another. Today it's climate change. Tomorrow it will be about the new critical minerals that are needed for technologies. So it's we will continue to say quite complex, but we have to take responsibility too in our regions to try to do this. At the same time, we are not alone, and that's why I say, what are the genuine partnerships? Where are the allies in the international community to come together to forward these agendas for peace? And there has to be a new way of tackling this, a new narrative to it as well.
Thank you. Okay, a couple more questions. Over here in the second row. Do you mind if I take a couple?
As long as they're women.
Okay.
And just had 2 men.
Yes.
My name is Fatima Alif. I'm from Somalia. I remember when Her Excellency came to Somalia to empower and encourage the women's participation in policy and decision making. I thank her. My question is, as we examine the intersection between the climate conflict and poverty, where women are disproportionately affected, what strategies that the UN employ to prevent these inequalities in the development sector? And how can we ensure a whole society development approach which no one is left behind? And also additionally, there is economic systems that empower inequality and sometimes empower those who already contributing to the war and conflict. So how can we get economic systems that empower equality, a whole society approach development, and a governance system that can serve everyone? Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think we don't have the answers to that. We have produced bucket loads of research and documents and resolutions on how to do that, and the latest of it is the Pact for the Future that says finish the SDGs, and within the SDGs it shows you exactly how you empower, because Goal 10 is about inequalities. The planning, the processes have to be more inclusive. All of these things we have said year after year after year. To implement them is where we have the problem. The governance and the leadership in countries, even in the international community, to incentivize with the funding that comes to countries that looks to include everyone rather than to get a project done. How is that project done? Who is consulted with it? Is it a project, or is it going to be an impact at scale on a health system, or is it just a primary healthcare center? There are many things that we have continued to argue for and to do. The commitments made on climate, if they could be fulfilled, and they could be targeted at what we are saying in those 17 goals, I think you would find some answers. We just need to implement the SDGs. Implementing it is a responsibility, first and foremost, of government. They have a responsibility and an imperative to do that for their people. But they can't do it alone. The private sector, academia, civil society, the population cannot be waiting for manna from heaven. They also have to engage and make those demands. That's why there's a democracy. That you put the people in place, that you continue to argue it. It works sometimes really well, especially when youth get involved. And two situations I can talk about on my continent. In South Africa, I think there was a time when everyone wanted a specific policy on health pushed through as part of the legislation. And it was not happening until civil society and young people mobilized around the Minister of Health and used social media, and very soon that poor minister could not use his phone, no matter how many phones he bought, and he changed, and eventually you got a policy. And you did that with persistence over time, and it took a few months, but in the end he needed to use his phone, so I guess his policy changed. But you need to be noticed. The other was in my country, young people saying that, look, we need to get into power because those that are in power are not doing it for us. And the first thing they did was to say, let's go and reduce the age, because we were pretty old by the time we could get into parliament. And they did do that. But where did we have the challenge? The challenge then was a system of politics, which didn't allow you in, even if the law did. And I think those things have to change in order to get us better outcomes. But there is a climate agenda. It does say that we're going to talk about adaptation and resilience, and as I said, as I heard today from many people, can you break that down for us? It's a budget in everyone's lives of how we deal with industry, education, food systems. These are all things that we know, and we need to push our governments to get done, and be more intentional about it. Of recent, what I've said to our teams is that if you do these three things, I believe that young people and women will be the beneficiaries. Focus on the full value chain from production to the table of food systems. We were hit hard in the world, not just in Africa, when we had the war in Ukraine. We saw that from what happened to energy. We saw that when what happened to food. The second thing is the food systems will make no difference if we don't power them, and that means having off-grid energy. It does not mean that we're going to green overnight, but at least at the local level, if we have a system that allows us to do that and investments that come in, then you will have a powered small and medium scale industry. And then for connectivity, the world is never going to be the same again. The new era of technology is here, AI is here, but it's good for women. Financial services, you can get online if you're connected. The extension work that would have to go miles to try to get that skill are now online. And I think more importantly, if you've got your goods and you need to take them to market, you don't have to rely on transportation so much anymore. Now we can use e-commerce and we can trade across borders. So there are many things that are available to us. It's very difficult to get people up and doing. And when you ask me how for some of these things, I would say back to everyone, the frameworks are there, the tools are there. How are you going to make them work? How are you going to deploy them? Because certainly for me in education, let me just say education because that was the first thing that I became an activist for, I wasn't waiting for anybody to tell me how. I knew I had a right with education for all. I knew my country did not have a plan. And so we made a lot of noise at government to say that you don't even have a plan for children and education. And so we want one and we demanded it. And in the end, didn't go the way we exactly thought because they asked me to just keep quiet and join government. That was their mistake, not mine, because then we got a plan. So you've got to be activists. You've got to go after it. It's not going to be given to you. I think we've given the tools. We've given the charter, the human rights, the constitutions that you all have. And you have to get up and be ready to, you know, I don't want to say literally break a leg, but you have to do something that will get you over the line to do it. But you need to put your frustrations and your anger into being, you know, deliberate about how to get these things done.
If I could just very quickly jump in here before I go to the next question. Speaking of frustration and anger, and then linking that to what you said earlier about funding and economics, I wonder, are reparations a part of the SDG vision? I mean, we've seen, for example, the CARICOM countries, some Commonwealth countries that very recently, and still as we speak, are demanding reparations from their former colonizers. So, and that's very much interlinked with a lot of what we're talking about today, and especially the SDGs. So I wonder, what place do reparations have in the SDGs?
Within the SDGs, they don't. I mean, that's why the fight still goes on.
Should they?
They should be, maybe the next set of goals. But the fight, in spite of the SDGs, the fight for reparations is still going on. What I would say is a good signal for that is that the Loss and Damage Fund would never have come about if the fight for reparations wasn't being fought. Now, the Loss and Damage Fund got up very quickly, but did it get funded in the way we thought? No, but it does have some funding. So it shows you that this is doable. With enough pressure, and with enough action, these things can happen. And I do believe that on the battle for reparations, that they will see eventually some returns on that. But it's a tall, hard fight, and it has to happen different places at the same time. It's not one fight.
Yes, I can imagine. Okay, so we will take. Yes, all right. I think we'll take a couple of questions at a time, if that's okay with you, Amina. So over here. And then to the right over here, the gentleman, the one who keeps raising his hand. So we'll go here and then over there. Oh, sorry, over here, please. I'm sorry.
Good evening, Your Excellency. Thank you for being here. It's such a pleasure. So upon hearing all the talks we had here, we talked about women being in power and how things can be changed, and the family. But we forgot one of the main important, what we can say, the factors of the world, our children. So the children in general, we say that they have to look for peace, they have to look for inclusivity, and then we sing the songs of peace like we are the world and we are the children among their classes, among their subjects. But then the world is more exposed right now. It's all in a click, and they can see the realities of what's happening around.
What's your question?
Yeah, the question is, when we have such an exposure in front of them and we say that world is for peace, for more than 1 year, like the host mentioned, the Gaza being the parent of the crisis around here, someone can just simply raise their hand and veto all the effort taken for peace. And more than that, not just Gaza, the crisis all around the world. It just goes on and on. So what can be the message we can give our children? Yes, we are truly working towards the peace which we are teaching you about.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Over here.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this, Your Excellency, Dr. Amina. I'm going to divide up my question into two parts. One,
very short, please.
Don't worry, it is a short question in its nature. One, for which nation, in your opinion, that is, do you think is in the most dire need for the 2030 the Sustainable Development Goals to be achieved? And also, two, which nation is considered like the biggest roadblock to set Sustainable Development Goals being achieved? Generally, that's the question, really.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That was short and sweet.
Okay. The last questions, I can answer them as Amina Mohammed, or I can be a real diplomat as the DSG. Which country? There is probably very few countries that don't need the SDGs today. There is no one country that I can say is in dire need more than another. If I try that just in the Caribbean, which island am I going to say doesn't need the SDGs? Because when I look at the levels of poverty, exclusion, crime, every one of them does. So I don't think there is any one country. The poorest country we say in our indices today is Chad. And Chad is the most generous country in the world today with refugees. It has 1.4 million refugees. Try bringing those across the border in Europe. So I think that we have Chad, if you have to say one that needs to be achieved, and it's so generous, but everyone does. Which are the countries that hold us back the most? The countries that manage our financial system. That's it. And I think you know those countries. So I stop there. And we are not letting them go to sleep, right? We're keeping fire under their feet, and we will continue to do so. When we say the international financial architecture is not working, we know who we're pointing to. This is power, and no one ever gives away power, right? So we have to try to wrestle it and negotiate it away. Women in power and children. I think what we have to teach children, because eventually they'll be adults like us, is about justice, is about solidarity. If we don't teach them those two words, we will not get peace. What are we doing about it? I think you also have to say to children there is leadership that's involved in this, and sometimes when it doesn't work, there is no peace. But I think you have to point to countries where actually we've had success. We had success in Liberia, we had success in Sierra Leone. It came at a huge cost, and we had child soldiers, we had kids that up to today, you will know they came from that war because they are maimed and they're disabled, but there is peace in those countries. Is there a, peace in the home and peace in democracy? Probably not. Every election is a struggle, but they've just had 2 elections and they were fairly free of violence. They may not have been judged by everyone to be free and fair. Is there peace in the home? No, there isn't. There's a huge amount of gender-based violence, not just in conflict, but in people's homes. So with children, I think the fundamentals of what we need to teach as what is just and what it means to care about the person next door, such that South Africa can get up and care for Gaza, but also what it means for justice, and when we've crossed the lines where there are so many injustices that are happening, from the small injustices to the very big ones. And then at the end of the day, point to success. I mean, the glass is always some full. We're sitting here talking and being frustrated about what isn't, but we wouldn't know that if it wasn't some full. So let's also build on success and say that it can happen and it must happen, because we can't leave many people behind.
Okay, we have time for just one last question.
You have
Which
to go
one?
right to the back,
Right
to the
in
lady
the back.
in pink.
The lady in pink in the back, yes. Who happens to be my colleague.
It's because we're in the same color today.
Yes.
She got the memo.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. Thank you for making the link between development and democracy. You actually reminded me of a paper written by the Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui on who killed democracy in Africa. And he talked about the goal of democracy being the same, but the means being different. And I'm thinking about the SDGs and, the conversation we're having in scholarship right now. How does indigenous knowledge, how is it used in talking about development goals? We've had a lot of those conversations in scholarly spaces, but I wonder if these conversations are getting to the United Nations and you are, acknowledging indigenous languages and their relevance in development. Thank you.
Yes, the answer is yes, we are. Does it get to where it needs to get to? Well, at the end of the day, it's about a country owning that policy change and that objective that you need. So yes, we take it to our country teams. We try to talk to civil society, to government, to get this across. Today, again, Her Highness was talking about language, and I believe that we're not taking enough cognizance of how useful and necessary indigenous knowledges for climate responses, for responses to food systems, for responses to even education, as we know it, can be better informed by that. And I hope that we can strengthen it, and maybe in this last 5 years for the Sustainable Development Agenda that we have more conversations about culture and about indigenous knowledge and about languages. We can use new technology to get that fast forwarded. I mean, today, communicating for me to Chinese people is not difficult. I don't recognize myself because I'm speaking Chinese, but people can hear me now because of AI. And it's in a language that they relate to. I know that in my language in Nigeria, one English word or a sentence that we will say, this is a lot of long grammar. If I'm translating it into Hausa, I will need, I'll need probably a couple of pages to do it. When I am greeting you in the morning, I am not coming into a room and just saying good morning or hi, what's up? No, there's a long greeting before we get to the subject. And if you don't do it, you've not established any relationship with one another. We're dismissing that these days. And I think that if we owe anything to the next generation, is that intergenerational conversation about how important it is. The president today was telling me about how many languages he has to speak to his kids or his grandchildren. Your mother tongue should be one that everyone speaks to regardless of what happens, because that's the one that identifies, that shapes you in your early being. All the other languages are the ones that help you to communicate for school, communicate for trade, communicate for a job, but they're means of communication. Fundamentally, we need to hold on to our own so that we are solid in our foundations. Now, you quoted Ali Mazrui. I'm going to quote Nelson Mandela, who always said that it seemed impossible until it's done, because that conversation here today, you're going to leave thinking, I didn't hear any answers to this, and I haven't given you the silver bullet. Well, there just isn't one in every case. We just have to get up every day and find a reason that we believe we need to work towards and be intentional about it and deliver. Look for the solutions. It's too easy to tell us what's wrong. It's very difficult to get up and do it, because suddenly you're going to be doing it for a decade when you intended to do something for a year. I thought my first job I'd get everything done in 2 years. 11 years later, I was still at the same place until I took a decision, I got to go. But this is what it is. Life is a journey. Every step must count, but you have to define what sort of a step that you want to make that. And then you do so, not just within your community, but with understanding that the globe today is so much more connected, and we cannot survive on an island. We cannot survive just as a region. What's happening in Sudan today is not just about Sudanese. The externalities that interfere with Sudan exacerbate the situation and the pathway to peace. And so I think understanding that we are a lot more than just us, me, it's about we.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you, UN Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed. Thanks for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be with us today for this very wide-ranging discussion. And thanks to all of you. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you join the next Education City Speaker Series. Thank you to Qatar Foundation and to the Qatar National Library, Your Excellency Dr. Hamad bin Abdulaziz Al Kawari, President of QNL, for providing the space for this very important discussion.